The goal of this lecture is to introduce you to our 4-series course, Introduction to Clinical Research. Typically, the focus of this course is to introduce the incoming residents and fellows to clinical research methods, and specifically research at KKESH. It's going to be somewhat different this year, and it'll be a repeat for a lot of the people that have heard this material before, but because the incoming fellows won't be beginning for a few months due to a change in schedule, we've altered it just a little bit and added in, hopefully, a little bit new information. But I think a lot of this information will also be helpful for those that might have heard it last year, might have even stayed awake during the lecture last year, but hopefully offer something new for everyone and hopefully provide something for everyone today. So we appreciate you coming today. So the subtitle for this, I think, really sums up what I want to talk about in the first 30 minutes, which is, why should I learn about clinical research? We come here to work as trainees, or we come here to work as faculty, and you think, I'm busy seeing patients. If I'm a fellow, I just want to fill my surgical log. I really don't care about doing research, but it's a requirement, so I guess I'll do it. Well, believe it or not, there's actually a very good reason why a clinical research requirement is part of the educational process here. So there's actually a reason for this. It's not just to torture the fellows. So your time is valuable. Whether you are a trainee or a senior consultant, your time is valuable. And so if you are choosing to do clinical research, or if you're a fellow, it has been chosen for you to do clinical research, there's a reason for that. So why should you invest time in learning research techniques? The reason is really that the body of knowledge in medicine is unknowably vast, and it's growing exponentially. In other words, none of us can ever hope to know what there is to know right now, and we're losing ground. We are losing ground every day as we learn a little bit, even more knowledge is gained. And how much of what you learn today will apply 20 years from now? I think if you ask people who have been practiced for more than 15 or 20 years, and certainly 30 years, if you ask them how many of the surgical techniques, diagnostic maneuvers, therapeutic interventions, how many of those are they still doing exactly the same as they did when they ended their training, it's actually a fraction. Now, obviously, a lot of the fundamentals are the same, so you have to learn a lot of these core concepts of medical care, but a lot of things change. And so if you expect to be handed a fund of knowledge, sort of a library to put on your shelf in your brain, and just use that for the rest of your career, you will get further and further behind, and your level of care will get worse and worse relative to the standard of care the longer you're in practice. So our goal is actually to teach you to learn. So you want to learn how to learn and accumulate new knowledge and learn to think critically. Because of this massive volume of knowledge out there, it's not all relevant, and a lot of it will be disproven, and your goal is to try to sift through this tidal wave of knowledge that's coming in and picking out what applies to you and your patients and how you want to improve the care that you provide. So that's our goal. There's 2 facets of the same skills: performing clinical research and critically reviewing the literature. And so even if you are at a point in your career where you don't plan on being primary investigator, you still are going to be reading the literature. And so even if you are a graduating fellow and you say, I've done my project, I'm never touching another research project again, hopefully you're going to be continuing to gain new knowledge, critically reviewing the literature, and it's all the same skill sets, and we'll try to show those parallels as we go through the lecture today. So the goals of this course are to introduce you to critical thinking, improve the way you evaluate new knowledge, whether it's as a researcher or as just a user of research as a clinician, increase your ability to conduct research, and introduce you to the resources available here at KKESH. And hopefully all this will combine to provide you the practical skills to plan, perform, present, and publish your research. This is an overview of the next 4 lectures, or the next 4 grand rounds. Today I'll be splitting time with Ms. Reem Al Khodair from our IRB, who will be giving you an introduction to the IRB Process and Ethics. So today is an introduction to clinical research, and then a discussion of IRB process. Next week is a good friend of mine and one of my former mentors, Tom Leitman, who's the director of the Proctor Foundation in San Francisco, and he has a vast wealth of knowledge on clinical trial design and epidemiology, and he'll be lecturing to us on clinical trials. The following week after that, we have our own Rajiv Kandakar here talking about designing and then planning clinical studies, and then Ahmed Musa from here in town as well, who often lectures with us, talking about an introduction to biostatistics. You obviously aren't going to finish these lectures as an expert in any of these topics, but the more you know, the further along the path you can begin. So the more you know about clinical trial design and biostatistics, the better you're able to interface with those people we have here who are experts in that to perform your studies. And then the final lecture will be again split with Abdul Rahman from our clinical trials section discussing informed consent and data collection, and then finally some tips for presenting and publishing your work. So the people you should know if you are brand new: my name is Don Stone. I'm the Director of Research. I'm easily available by email or in my office. Abdul Rahman Al-Hamadi is our clinical research manager, so a lot of our trials interface with him, so he's a good contact person for our clinical trials. Rajiv Khandekar is our Chief of Ophthalmic Epidemiology, and again, you'll be hearing more from him the week after next. Nasira Asghar is our biostatistician, and all of our research projects have to be evaluated and approved by her, and over the next few weeks, you'll find out why that's important. And then you won't be hearing from them directly at this lecture, but in the future, hopefully hearing some updates. We have 2 translational scientists on our staff, and they are key resources for our research here, Dr. Safieh and Mahali. And then lastly, you'll again hear more from Ms. Reem later about IRB, and then Dr. Hassan Al-Dibi is our chair of the IRB on our staff here. Let's back up and talk about the history of clinical research a little bit. This character in the image here is supposedly Imhotep, assuming that's what Imhotep looked like, an Egyptian practitioner. I don't want to say physician because it encompassed dentistry and many other things. And this was what we would call empirical medicine. This was basically an astute observer looking at the way things happen and looking at what happens when you institute an intervention and then maybe trying something different next time. And so it wasn't just randomly trying interventions to try to help people. It was based on observation and based on their understanding of pathophysiology. Hippocrates summed this up also, saying that a great part of the art is to be able to observe. And so we get caught up in this era of randomized clinical trials and large-scale studies and molecular epidemiology, but a lot of what we do in medicine is based on the observations of those in the clinic, and that's still a key part of research. And Sir Isaac Newton said, "If I have seen a little further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." So nothing that we do is done in a vacuum. Any discoveries, new innovations, are based on those that came before us, and we have to recognize that. And interestingly, really the first well-described treatise on clinical trials was by Ibn Sina back about 1,000 years ago, so before even KKESH, believe it or not. And he basically gave a nice description of the steps involved in evaluating new treatments and ways you could evaluate them, and it was describing a rational approach to clinical studies. And so this is not a new idea or a new concept that we're coming up with this week. In the 1940s, the idea of a controlled clinical trial really began to catch hold. So there was really a delay there of kind of a stagnation of clinical trials. We still were in this observational, empirical phase for a long time. And then in the 1940s, the idea of not only prospective and randomized trials, but having a control group, that really became more popular and really added to the quality of literature that we used. And ophthalmology has not been left out in this. Not only were these historical practitioners often treating eye diseases. When you think about the diseases that plagued the ancients, a lot of them were cataract, trachoma, and so a lot of the old textbooks that you read from hundreds or thousands of years ago, a lot of them spend a lot of time talking about strabismus, trachoma, cataracts. And so we've been involved in clinical innovation from the beginning. Harold Ridley is one of my favorite characters, and the story is that back in World War II for the Battle of Britain, these British Spitfire and Hurricane pilots would come into the hospital and they would have pieces of their acrylic cockpit shot up and intraocular foreign bodies. And the dogma at the time, the teaching that was given by every graybeard that knew everything, and it was in every textbook, is that the eye would not tolerate a foreign body. This was just known and not to be questioned. But his observation was that these pieces of acrylic would often be very well tolerated inside the eye. And actually in discussion with the medical student, the question came up, well, why don't we make an intraocular lens? And he was ridiculed. I mean, he was really shunned by the ophthalmology establishment because everybody knew that you couldn't put a foreign body in the eye. Well, in 1950, he implanted the first IOL. And of course, at the time, he wasn't Sir Harold Ridley. That came later after his idea worked. And so really one of the great innovations in modern ophthalmology. And interestingly, it was not popular at the time. This guy really had to go against convention. Huell and Weissel, probably the only vision researchers in ophthalmology to win the Nobel Prize, but in 1981 won the Nobel Prize in physiology for the work on the visual system. It's kind of a depressing topic. They actually gave kittens amblyopia. That doesn't sound like a very fun job, but it actually really shed a lot of insight onto what we now know about the development of the visual system in amblyopia. And then Charles Kelman, just one of many innovators I think you could list in this list of people in the past few decades, invented the cryoprobe that was used for intracapsular cataract surgery, and then now still being used today for retinal cryopexy. So this is an idea that really has withstood the test of time. He also pioneered ultrasonic phacoemulsification. This was also ridiculed. He was really a pariah for a while because all the establishment said that this ultrasound energy is going to be too toxic to the eye, and there's no way that this will work. But he really persevered and led to one of these great innovations in modern ophthalmology. So this is exciting to talk about these pioneers and these people that really had the vision to take an idea and see it through to completion. And this, when you think of people that are maybe a little crazy seeing ideas through completion, you think of Richard Branson, for example. And he said, you have to passionately believe it is possible to change the industry, to turn it on its head, to make sure that it will never be the same again. And again, this is an inspiring quote, and we think, wow, wouldn't it be great to change our profession like that? The problem is that you could also use the same quote for a lot of really crazy people that have done really horrible things throughout history, who passionately believed they were doing the right thing and didn't listen to all the naysayers who said, no, that's a bad idea, and carried on with that. So the drive to publish for notoriety, or maybe the drive for profit, if it's driven by industry or other motivations, can blind us to bias. And we can say, this is fantastic. I want to be the Charles Kelman, the Richard Branson, fill in your hero here. I want to have this drive to be successful and do something great. And that may be great, but we also need safeguards, and we need voices of reason. The young chiefs going out to war need the elders in the village to say, let's slow things down a little bit and think about this. And that's a lot of the concept of what we talk about with an IRB and ethical control is for this very reason. And many of the innovations in medicine have come at the expense of unprotected patients, and we have to acknowledge that and try to learn from those mistakes and not repeat that in the future. So I think the best example of this, and we could give a lot of these, but one that you may hear about and probably already know a lot about, but it's the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. To give you some of the historical perspective here, this started in 1932 and ended in 1972, and these dates are important. So 1932, it's the depths of the Depression in the United States. And this is really the first generation after the Civil War for these freed slaves. So they were the lowest level of poverty that existed in the United States at the time. And they were basically offered free meals on the day of their clinic visits and free visits by a nurse or a doctor on the days of their study visits to participate in this observational study of syphilis. Of course, none of them were told they had syphilis. They were just told they had bad blood or something vague like that. And so at the time, this was approved because there was no treatment for syphilis anyway. There had been some previous studies done in Europe that had basically already answered all these questions, but they wanted to see if the findings were the same in African Americans. Well, interestingly, in the 1940s, penicillin became available. So now you have an observational study for a disease for which there is a treatment, and there's actually good documentation that even at the highest levels at the CDC, there was a conscious decision to continue the study and knowing that there was a treatment available. Now, part of this might be because the endowment that had been set aside to pay for treatment for these men had disappeared with the Great Depression, and so maybe it was because no one knew where to get the money to treat these men. But for whatever reason, at every level, the decision was made to continue this observational study and withhold treatment. In 1964, again, 30 years into this study, the World Health Organization came out with the Declaration of Helsinki. And this is that participants in research must give informed consent. And the two words being informed, meaning they have to really understand the best they can what they are participating in, and then they have to agree to it. And so that's an important concept that we'll come back to later. So this happened in 1964. So it wasn't like during the Tuskegee experiment nobody was talking about informed consent, and this was just an idea that came out of the blue in the 1970s. Finally, there were whistleblowers, and the Tuskegee experiment was stopped. And in fact, it was such a big deal that in 1979, there were a lot of federal laws passed in the United States. And the 1979 Belmont Report established federal regulations requiring institutional review boards. So if you wonder why we have an IRB, really a lot of it stems from this study and others like it that made everyone realize that you can't leave the fox in charge of the henhouse, that you have to have outside observers making sure that we aren't getting off track and doing things that are unethical. And I think the recognition here is that even people with the best intentions, the people performing the study probably weren't, I hope, inherently evil people. I think they probably had science as their goal. Maybe it was their career development, but they ended up doing a horrible thing based on that bias. And it would have been nice to have some outside body looking at it and saying, this is a bad idea. So it's good to have outside controls. So how tall are the giants we stand on? We talk about standing on the shoulders of giants and evidence-based medicine. Let's talk a little bit about how we categorize evidence and how we use the research that we produce. So this is an older paragraph, or older pyramid. Sometimes even in a fairly well-designed randomized controlled trial, there may be bias. Maybe the population they're studying is not like the next patient that's going to walk in your clinic. So maybe their results don't apply to your patient. Maybe there are other flaws that no one thought of. And so there's a new consideration, and this is from the Oxford Center for Evidence-Based Medicine, that they say that level 1 is a systematic review of randomized trials. And again, we don't always have this level of evidence. We don't always have a dozen great randomized prospective trials to compare and pool together in a systematic review. But if you have that, that is the highest level of evidence. And that helps smooth out any flukes that might have happened statistically just because of patient populations or design of the trial. When people do the same studies slightly differently in different populations and still come up with a positive result, it's more believable. So this is the highest level of evidence. Level 2 is a randomized controlled trial, or even an observational study if the effect is dramatic. There are some things that we don't need to study. Being hit by a truck while crossing Aruba Road will lead to injury. We don't need to do a randomized controlled trial of that observation. So that's at least level 2 evidence there. Level 3 is non-randomized trials, cohort studies, other evidence that may be the best we have if we don't have a prospective randomized trial, but it's not quite as good as the others. Level 4 is case series, case control studies, or historically controlled studies. And then level 5 is, again, just what we think is best. It's based on the mechanisms of disease or the pathophysiology or maybe a single case report. And actually, you'll notice that on this newer description of the levels of medicine, they actually don't mention case reports. And I think that's intentional. And you'll find that a lot of the top-tier journals are actually discouraging case reports now. Now, I still think it's a good exercise in writing and publishing a paper. I think there are a lot of interesting things that should be published to share knowledge and improve our clinical care. But the reason why case reports are getting less attention in the literature is that just from rare association, just because something happens connected to something else doesn't mean it's related. I had Fruit Loops for breakfast last week, and my patient had an explosive choroidal hemorrhage. Statistically, if I've only eaten Fruit Loops once, then 1 out of 20,000 days, the statistical odds of that being associated with a patient having a choroidal hemorrhage, that's going to have a p-value of 0.0000 something. But that doesn't mean it's causative. And so the danger of the case report and the danger of the anecdotal evidence is that really it shouldn't convince you. It's interesting, but you should really pause whenever you see a case report. There was an interesting instance a few years ago when the shingles vaccine, the zoster vaccine, became available. And I had a patient that was asking if they should get the shingles vaccine, and they were struggling with zoster-related eye inflammation. And I said, I don't know. It may promote inflammation. It may help suppress the virus. Maybe it's good. There's no data on that. But the patient went on their own and had the vaccine, and their inflammation got better. And I thought, well, maybe I should write this up as a case report. And the next week, a case report came out of another patient that had the vaccine and got worse. And their conclusion was, the vaccine obviously stimulates inflammation and makes the disease worse. But depending on whose case report got published first, completely opposite conclusions. So you can see that really case reports, while they're interesting, be very cautious in how much weight you give them. So let's talk about the entire research process from idea to publication. And we'll talk about this both from the concept of performing research and critically reviewing the literature. You need to come up with an idea or question or hypothesis. And a lot of times for trainees, this is the hard part because they don't know what they don't know. There are gaps in their knowledge, and it may be things that everyone else knows, but just not them. So you have to identify a knowledge gap, something that would be interesting to answer. Then you have to determine the best way to answer that question. What type of study do you perform? You have to define the endpoints to be measured, and what are the statistical fidelity of those results? You can generate a lot of numbers, but sometimes that doesn't mean anything. Then what are the ethical considerations of the study design and the way you're performing the study? How do you gather the data and keep it accurate? and then analyzing the data, and then presenting it and publishing it. So these are the steps of the research process. Easy as that, right? And then that actually leads to the next step, which is hypothesis generation. And if you did any programming back in the days of BASIC and those sorts of things, this is basically a continuous loop. And go to line 1. And so research is a continuous process that we never reach the end of, hopefully. And I basically changed the title of this slide. It's exactly the same. When you are critically reviewing the literature, you do the exact same thing. You identify what is the idea, what is the research question, what knowledge gap are they trying to fill? And then, how did they go about answering that? What was the study design? How did they define this? What are the endpoints that they measured? What's the statistical fidelity of the results? In other words, they generated a lot of numbers, but do the numbers really mean what they propose? What are the ethical considerations of the study? How did they gather and analyze the data? Was there any bias in the way it's presented or published? And then you make your own conclusions and generate hypotheses. So you can see that really the reason that we encourage our trainees to perform clinical research is that, yes, it's great to contribute to the literature, but it also makes you a much better reader of the literature because it's all the same steps and all the same skills. Once you've generated a hypothesis, then you can move on with these other steps. But again, this is often the hardest step for someone who's in training. And it's a good idea to discuss your ideas and observations with your faculty mentors. Ask them why. When you're in clinic and they do something that you haven't read about, say, oh, why do we do that? And if they give you another explanation, ask why again. It's like having anyone who's had children age 3 to 6. There's that endless question of why. And we should be like that. We should have this endless curiosity of why things happen and why not. A lot of the best research questions have come from medical students and residents who questioned something that I had just accepted, and they said, why? And my answer was, I don't know. We should figure that out. And that's where a lot of these great research questions come from. So always be asking why. And let the faculty know that you are interested in research. A lot of times they'll have some ideas that they've been kicking around in their head and just waiting for some enthusiastic fellow to take on and lead the charge. And then go back and perform background reading and a literature review. Find out what is already known. There's a saying that nothing is new under the sun. And a lot of times a great research idea, believe it or not, someone else might have had the same idea. And so often there will at least be similar studies or background that you need to read and be familiar with. So we'll go just briefly over the steps of research here as well. So you begin with an introduction to methodology. To give you the big picture, it's a little intimidating to write a research manuscript. You look at this large thing and you think, wow, how can I sit down on a Saturday afternoon and write this 3,000-word complex piece of work? Well, actually, you don't do it all at once. So you start with introduction to methodology, and you actually should write this before you even begin the research, because you have to do a background literature review anyway. When you submit to the IRB, you have to explain to the IRB what knowledge already exists and why this research project makes sense. So a lot of your introduction is just doing the same thing for the reader of the article. So you should already have this done before you even submit to the IRB. And the analogy here is that you really can't go on a journey without knowing where you are, what's the current knowledge base, what's the knowledge gap, where are you going, and then your methodology is how are you going to get from here to there. And this allows the readers or the reviewer to understand and able to replicate your journey. So if I'm reading an article and I don't think that I could do the same project because they don't explain all the details, I don't know that I believe it. Are they hiding things and not mentioning details because it might detract from the believability of their paper? And when I say this can be modified based on the outcome of the study, meaning the introduction, not the methodology. You can't go back and alter your methodology once you're done. But you write this introduction, this literature review, and let's say you find some different results or it generates a new hypothesis, you can always go back and change this discussion a little bit if you need to. Next to the results section, you want to provide all the specific details. Again, you want to allow others to critically evaluate the data, and the reviewers should distrust you, and you must convince them. So this is not just a discussion among friends who already believe you. You have to assume that they don't believe you and convince them otherwise. You have to be painfully honest. If there are things that don't fit your hypothesis or that don't fit your conclusions, you really need to present them anyway and try to explain them if you can. Utilize visual representations if you can, but don't just duplicate the text. That annoys the editors and the readers. So then the discussion section is an opportunity to explain your results, put it in context. You should explain where potential weaknesses and flaws might be in the paper, because believe me, the reviewers will, so you might as well beat them to it and go ahead and put it in there first. And it also shows you understand the research methods. This is the place to propose new hypotheses and describe how the results fit in the big picture. What does this new information mean for the reader? And in general, the KKESH department is here to help you. Just ask us. This research is a key part of your journey as physicians, whether you are just beginning or a few more years into it, and we hope to help you along that journey as much as we can. And it doesn't have to be intimidating, and if you have any questions along the way, feel free to approach us and let us know. Thanks for your time today.
And I'm going to talk to you about the IRB, what we do, and about the ethics that we look into. Here's some definitions. IRB stands for Institutional Review Board. It's the committee that has been formally designed to approve, monitor, and review biomedical and behavioral research involving humans. They often conduct some form of risk-benefit analysis in an attempt to determine whether or not research should be done. So this is the main purpose of the IRB. Human subject research is a scientific investigation that can be either interventional or observational and involves human beings as research subjects. Human subjects research can be either medical research or non-medical. So it's like the retrospective projects, which are the medical records. The ethics. They're made up of, these are the 6 components that usually are in ethics that you should always consider: the rules and the regulations, the values, the research, the moral principles, the ethical practices, the rules of conduct. The regulations that are usually followed are, we've got the standard operating procedures from the MOH. We have international regulations that can be found on the Health and Human Services website. The Belmont Report, which is why the IRB was established. These are the main. First thing is the respect for persons. You've got the justice and the beneficence. The Declaration of Helsinki was also one of the reasons why IRB was established. The World Medical Association binds the physicians with the wording, "The health of my patient will be my first consideration." So this is thinking of the benefit and the risks and making sure that you're protecting them and not thinking of yourself. The authority of the IRB is to disapprove, approve, or modify studies that have been considered for human subject protection aspects, to require progress reports for investigators and oversee the conduct of the study, to suspend or terminate approval of a study for some specific reason, to place restrictions on a study if they see fit. Who does the IRB report to? The IRB here in Saudi reports to the National Commission of Bioethics, which is located in KKESH. We've got 43 registered IRB committees in Saudi Arabia alone. 12 of them are located in Riyadh. The Strategic Center for Diabetes Research, the Saudi Center for Organ Transplantation, King Fahd Medical City, the College of Science in King Saud University, King Abdulaziz Medical City, Prince Sultan Military Hospital, General Administration for Research and Studies in the MOH, the Saudi Food and Drug Authorities, Prince Sultan Military Medical City, King Saud Medical City, and the Specialized Medical City. The history of KKESH IRB. King Khaled Eye Hospital was, the IRB for KKESH was established in 1984, which was 1 year after the hospital was open. And we registered with the National Committee of Bioethics in March of 2015. The IRB committee, the members are just not anybody. There are specific people that have to be in the committee, have to have at least 5 KKESH physician members represented from both genders, so there's no bias. 4 of whom must be medical ophthalmologists, and 1 is from the medical staff, but not an ophthalmologist. At least 2 members represented from both genders from KKESH who are non-physicians and are selected from the nursing, the health, or the social services. And at least 1 member who is not in KKESH or from an outside organization. At least 1 of 3 members who are not members of the KKESH and medical staff must have a non-scientific background. So somebody who is doesn't have any scientific background, sometimes we consider it like the nursing department. The membership of the IRB, these are the 2016 members of the IRB. We have Dr. Hassan Al-Dibi, who is the chair, Abdullah Al-Hmedan, who is from pharmacy, Alicia Galindo, Enrique Suarez, Igor Kozak, ختام المرشد, محمد الشمراني, Munir Hassan, Uhud Uweva, Patrick Schatz, Rania Madani, Randy Craven, Rizwan Malik, Samar Suwalim, and Silvana Scalini. These are the members for 2016. The functions of the IRB: to conduct initial and continue review, report in writing findings and actions of the IRB to the investigator and the institution, determine which study requires review more often than annually. We usually request annually that prospective projects to get progress reports, but sometimes if we see fit, we can shorten that time to like 6 months. Determine which study needs verification from sources other than the investigators, that no material changes have occurred since previous IRB review. Ensure prompt reporting to the IRB of changes in research activities. Ensure that changes in approved research are not initiated without IRB review and approval, except when necessary to eliminate apparent immediate hazard. So these are the amendments. If anybody wants to make an amendment, you should get an approval before taking any kind of changes. This includes in the protocol, changing anything in your methods, adding, removing people, or like the objectives, inclusion criteria or exclusion. Ensure prompt reporting to the IRB, appropriate institutional officials, and the Saudi FDA. This is the anticipated problems involving risk to subjects or others, serious or continuing non-compliance or the recruitments of the IRB. And the last is have suspension of or termination of the IRB approval, determining which medical device studies pose significant or non-significant risks to patients. These are the types of projects. The IRB may review different types. These are some but not all, so they're not limited to these. We have clinical trials, we have epidemiology research, social science research, research on medical records or other personnel information, research on stored samples, health systems research, implementation and research. We have 3 kind of review categories: the full review, the exemption, and the expedited review. The full review is proposed human subject research which does not fall into either the exempt or expedited review categories and must be submitted for full committee reviews. The exempt reviews, examples of them are survey research, interview research, observational or public behaviors if the investigator is going to be actively involved in the observation. The expedited review are certain kinds of research involving no more than minimal risk and for minor changes in approved research. These are the levels of the IRB review. You've got the exempt, then you've got the expedited and the full. So the exempt is the less than minimal risk, the expedited not greater than minimal risk, and then the full board review are more than minimal risk to subjects. These are time frames. Usually we expect case reports to take 6 months to be completed and published. The reviews are the same. The retrospective projects are about a year. The technical reports are about a year also, and prospective projects take around 2 years. These are estimates. You can go over, but you have to inform us how long it's going to take. In the IRB office, so you just understand when you submit your projects, what we do. When you first submit your projects, we have to make sure that it's not a duplication, it's not duplicated. We give it a specific number because sometimes it's hard. We have long titles and it's hard to memorize all of them, so we just give them numbers. It's easier when you call us to check on the process of your project or want to know what's going on. We check the application and supporting documents to make sure everything is complete. You explained everything, all your like patient information sheet, consent sheet, collaborative agreement if you need one, is also attached. We do provisional approval and then medical staff notification. Medical staff notification usually is 7 days. We give anybody 7 days to either say something about the project, to challenge it. The expedited review, the approval and or disapproval decision is made 7 days after the medical staff notification. The full board review is sent usually to 2 reviewers, and then it's discussed during the next meeting. The 2 reviewers you are the only ones who know who the investigators are on a project. The rest of the committee don't know. We mask all the investigator names, so we just stay away from biased reviews. These are the type of IRB decisions you have approved, and the project can start once you get your approval email. It's a letter, you'll get it through email. The minor revisions, you revise it. You revise your application with the comments and the suggestions of the reviewers and committee members, and it is re-reviewed by the IRB chair or by a specific reviewer, and then the decision is made. So it doesn't go to a full IRB, to a next full IRB meeting. The major revisions goes to a full IRB meeting and it's rediscussed. Disapproved, the project is rejected, it's disapproved. You cannot revise it in any way, but you can resubmit with a new title and a new protocol with the changes that were suggested by the committee. These are the timeframes for resubmission. From the initial review, when it's initially reviewed, if you get an email saying that these issues needs to be addressed or changed, we give you usually 1 month to resubmit. The revision after an IRB review, when you get the decision, the IRB decision memo, usually give you 2 months to resubmit the revised application. Documents that need to be submitted. So these are the 3 different projects that we have, and these are the documents that have to be submitted for each type. You've got the prospective, which is the application, the investigator assurance form, which lists the policies and some of the regulations that we have. So signing is acknowledging. The data collection sheet, the patient information sheet, and the consent form. So these 5 documents need to be submitted for the prospective projects. The retrospective projects, you only have to submit the application form, the investigator assurance form, and the data collection sheet. For case reports, you don't even fill out the whole application. You fill out specific pages for case reports, and then you have to submit the investigator assurance form. This is what the cover page of the application looks like. The most important thing is the title, what type of project you're going to be submitting, and the names of the investigators. If you notice in the second row, there's a blank right there, because sometimes we have 2 principal investigators. So we left that blank and you just fill it in saying if that person is a co-investigator or a principal investigator. And you have to, on the bottom, you have to state the subjects, how many patients, the source, where you're going to be getting those patients from, and if there's any minors. This is really important in human ethics to protect the children. So we have to know if you're going to be involving kids or not, because we kind of focus a little bit more. On the second page, you have, this is for residents, fellows, optometrists, medical students. You have your supervisor needs to sign, and the biostatistician at KKESH. Some people, they do their own statistical work, or they have Dr. Ahmed Musa do it, but we still need our biostatistician just to make sure that your pool, the target that you're going for, the subject number is enough for your conclusion or for your goal. These are all, next pages, these are all the part 1 from the application. You just tick the appropriate boxes for each one. The age, if you're going to use any identifiable data, the age group. You have the support if you're going to get budget support from somewhere. And if you put monetary or material or equipment, you should submit a separate piece of paper explaining from where you're going to be getting and how much. And then here you've got, if you're doing off-label medications or devices, to tick it and you list exactly what it is. This is just a continuation. Then the study location. Sometimes we have projects that are collaborative with other institutes, so you also have to list it. Here, you tick that box and then you state exactly which institute, the risk for patients, and then you have the institutional and cultural liabilities. Make sure you answer these questions, yes or no. The consent waivers. So for prospective projects, you've got patient information and the written consent. These have to. For retrospective, it's usually consent waiver, and then you say, state who's going to obtain the consent and who's going to be giving it. So sometimes you've got the children, if their representatives usually does it. Older people, their representatives usually do it if they're not able to read or write or understand. The patients, or both. You can just state both if you have no problem with that. This also goes back to the data confidentiality. You have to make sure you read this because this is really important in confidentiality. We don't like anything to be shared, especially because we have to protect our patients. We have to protect these subjects in any way, so nobody can tie back who they are by any like numbers, names, addresses, ID numbers. And then the principal investigator signs here after reading the certification and the pledge. This is part 2. This is where you go into depth and explain exactly what your project is about. You've got the title, the purpose. You can briefly describe the purpose, the background, the hypothesis, the methods you will use, and the utilization. This is for case reports. You will list the case reports that you're going to be including. Usually case reports are up to 5 medical record numbers. If you're going more than that, then it becomes a case series. The background and review of literature, the specific aims and objectives, the experimental design and methods, and you have to specify the sample size here. And the management and work plan, you have to mention the investigators' names and what each person is going to be doing in the project. And finally is the utilization and your references. This is what the patient information sheet. We have a specific guide that we go by for the patient information sheet, and I can provide that to you if you need it. You have to state the purpose of the research, the description, potential risk, the potential benefit, the alternative to participate, the costs and the reimbursements, if any, termination of participation, compensation, voluntary participation, and confidentiality, and the contact person in case of any emergency. You have to make sure when you write the patient information, you write it thinking of a 6th grade level of education. So don't use big words or describe in a fancy way. Try to make it really simple and precise so they can be able to understand it. You fill in the English part, send it to us. We will get it translated into Arabic. This is what the consent form. It's a standard form. Nothing is changed except for the title, the project number, and the investigator's name. So you can just go ahead, fill that in. We'll do the Arabic part, and then when it's approved, we will state when the project was approved, and it can be the patient information sheet and the consent form is used for 1 year. After we get the progress report, we will renew it for another year. And that's it.
If you have any questions now, this would be a good time. If you have a question you think everyone else might be interested in. Perhaps, Reem, actually, if you might, something I was just thinking of, a question that I'm often asked that I often don't have a good answer for is people ask, what's the timeline for submitting a project? In other words, I've got this great idea, I've turned in my IRB application, can I start tomorrow? What's the usual timeline for a full board review type submission for expecting it to be reviewed and getting a response back?
Usually for case reports and for retrospective projects. For case reports and retrospective projects, when you submit it and it's complete, the medical staff notification, it takes 7 days. Just 7 days for those 2 kinds of projects to be approved. For prospective projects, we usually target 1 month because we do have a meeting every month, which is usually the first Tuesday of every month, and we discuss projects at that time.
Great, thanks. Any other questions? All right, thanks again. I appreciate everyone's. Oh, yes, sorry.
You have a drug A, which is the standard, and you have a new drug, which is B, which is the new drug, which was tested before at the proof of efficacy in the lab, shown in animals. So when you want to test the drug B, do you test it as a control with drug A, or you put it in addition to drug A, another control group, which is better?
Yeah, that depends. So the question is, if you have a standard treatment or a standard drug that's what is, I would assume, shown to be effective, then you have a new drug that there's animal studies or other preliminary studies showing it to be effective, do you compare to the existing treatment or to placebo? And I think it depends. I think that a lot of new treatments now, there is an expectation to do at least some type of placebo-controlled study, or if it's unethical, we know that there's a better treatment that has been proven to be better than placebo, then you have to do a comparative study to whatever the standard is and show that it's superior or at least non-inferior. It really kind of depends on the treatment, on I think what is best and what the regulations are regarding that. But that's a good point, that when there's an existing treatment that's known to be effective, and I think that's the key, is that if the existing treatment has been proven with placebo-controlled trials to be effective, then I think you have to compare to that. It's probably not ethical to use a placebo if there is a treatment available. All right, thanks again.
I want to announce that your evaluations are online now, starting today. I saw the email that your medical education has gone paperless, and I think the evaluations are online on your. So all of you probably received an email today, so you can finish your evaluation online. It's pretty straightforward. I just finished it. It takes 30 seconds.
Oh yeah, that's a great point actually. One thing I forgot to put on this, and I should have, is the on the website, on the internet, we actually have most of the IRB forms and everything you need. So rather than hassling Reem and having her send those to you, and sometimes there are old versions that are still floating around. I know I've been guilty of that, of using old ones I had on my computer. So all the updated forms are on the website, and you can download most of those and have access to those.